of given some hints yesterday that the first starting point is that most of the people in the world have experienced stuff like this. So this is an experience that's common to humanity. It's baked into our Christian faith. So for those of us who are believers in Christ, trauma's all over the scriptures.
And if you get into the stories of a lot of the saints of old, trauma's all over their stories as well. And if this is something that's so common, and I'll share a little bit more about research of of things that we found out about how does trauma actually impact and unfold in a person's story. The short answer is that if we don't address it, it's quite common for trauma to actually shape our entire lives in both helpful ways and in not so helpful ways as well. So as I mentioned earlier, why is it important to talk about this? Well, most of us have experienced it. And also that the impact of these kinds of experiences can actually be long-term, and I think conventional assumptions or conventional wisdom might suggest, because at the church that I'm a part of and I help pastor, in fact, just literally drove straight from my church to y'all's church here this afternoon. At our church, we have a lot of families with children who are in foster care or children who are adopted. And in that world, oftentimes foster parents or adoptive parents will come in with this assumption that, these children who are in the foster care system, research has found that children in the foster care system have higher levels of trauma than military combat veterans. The levels of PTSD and trauma exposure actually over and above military combat veterans. And there's this assumption that if we take this child from a traumatizing environment and put them in a safe environment, that more or less everything's going to heal on its own, And we find that that's actually not the case. Taking someone and putting them into a safe place is actually a really good thing, but it's really just the beginning of their healing journey. And especially if we don't address some of these things, unfortunately, the experience of trauma can unfold like step by step over the course of one's entire life, affecting not only our heart and our emotions, but also our minds and our physical bodies as well. And we'll get into some of those details throughout this afternoon together. For those of you who like reading theological books, this topic of trauma is, and I'm really grateful for this, it's gaining a lot of traction in the theological literature too. So in the last 10 years in particular, a lot of theologians are starting to write on the topic of trauma. And one of them, who's a friend of mine, she's at Boston University. Her name is Shelley Rambo. She wrote one of my favorite theological books on trauma, and it's called Spirit and Trauma. So if this is something of interest, I highly recommend you pick up a copy of Shelley Rambo's book, Spirit and Trauma. But in that book, she says this. She says, trauma is what does not go away. It persists in symptoms that live on in the body. It persists in the intrusive fragments of memories that return. It persists in symptoms that live on in communities, right? So there's something about trauma, like even for those of us who have done a lot of healing, done a lot of recovery, made a lot of progress in our recovery journey from things like trauma, there's still something about trauma that just doesn't go away. It stubbornly persists. It sticks around. And there's many different ways that it might stick around and persist. One of the ways that she mentions is that it might live on in our body in some ways, right? And the way that the mind and the body is connected, it's very mysterious at times. It's quite profound. But sometimes for people who are earlier in their journey, you can actually see both concrete and symbolic connections between what's going on in their body and the trauma stories that they've had, right? And sometimes it's completely symbolic, where something happened in their past life, for example, and that was very, very stressful. And an example would be, and ever since for the last 10 years, they've had digestion and stomach issues. They've had irritable bowel syndrome, and these digestive issues that have been diagnosed by a medical doctor, and they didn't realize until much later that actually these physical symptoms have, as part of their roots, this psychological hurt from a trauma that happened a long time ago. And once we address that trauma alongside good medicine, it actually was one of the keys to help address some of the physical ailments that we've experienced. So trauma can live on in our bodies. It can also live on in the intrusive fragments of memories that return. And here Shelley's talking about one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, this symptom of re-experiencing our trauma over and over again. I don't know if you guys have experienced this. I have, and I've also walked with a lot of people who've experienced this as well, where even though the traumatic event happened in the past, it's almost as if there's a part of our heart, there's a part of our mind that's not done remembering what happened. So we might be just walking down the street, minding our own business, and all of a sudden, almost like the intruder into our mind, like the memory just keeps recurring over and over again. Like we don't want to think about it, it's not very fun, but it just seems to have a mind of its own, and it re-enters our mind. It feels like over and over and over again. And that's a symptom of trauma as well. Re-experiencing, it's like the memories of what happened, happening over and returning over and over again. And sometimes I use analogies like the analogy of a book, where it feels like, the story of our lives, if they were being written in different chapters of our book, it feels like there is a chapter that was written about our lives during the time of the trauma, and that chapter never got finished, right? And until that chapter is finished, it's like a part of our mind wants to go back to that chapter over and over again until we finish that chapter, right? Or another analogy that I often will use is that of getting food poisoned. Have y'all ever been food poisoned? It's not very fun, right? And how do you heal from food poisoning? You can't, sometimes you can take medicine, but if there are physicians here, I don't think there's really a medication you can take. Like the only way to heal from food poisoning is it has to pass through your body, either like one way or another way, right? And or there might be. And sometimes that's where, coming in for counseling and psychotherapy might be helpful, because it's a way for it to actually finally pass through, right? And when those memories of what happened in the past keep returning in our mind, it's oftentimes a reminder that there's still some poisonous food in our system that we haven't quite passed yet, right? And for many reasons, we very understandably don't want to think about it, don't want to pass it. We just kind of want to push it aside because it's not fun to remember, because all sorts of memories and feelings and thoughts come back that aren't very pleasant. And what counseling does, what sharing your story with a friend does, it's like we get to take a bite out of that mass that's been stuck in your stomach for a really long time. And Lord willing, eventually we can work through enough of that where it'll eventually find its way out. When it does come out, oftentimes it's not very pretty, but that's okay. That's part of the process, right? So, and then finally, it persists in symptoms that live on in communities. And I'm not sure if we're going to have time to go into this as much, but I would suggest, or I'd like to raise this possibility with you all, that trauma actually shapes not just individuals, but communities. So if something happened in a community that's tightly knit, it's going to impact not just individuals, but the entire community. And if you look at that from a larger perspective, a larger scale, I would even suggest that trauma at times, oftentimes, shapes entire cultures, right? You don't have to agree with me on this, but I would suggest that if we look at the history of America, that we haven't fully healed from things like the Civil War. We haven't fully healed from things like slavery. We seem to kind of repeat a lot of that history because we haven't actually fully processed a lot of that kind of stuff. But that's just one context. When I teach on trauma, like for example in Cambodia, if you know a little bit about the history in Cambodia, trauma has very much shaped that culture as well. I've taught also in Latin America and the Middle East, and trauma also shapes that culture. And I remember, and I'll just share one more thing before I go to the next slide. I did a trauma training with Ukrainian Christians and Ukrainian theological educators. And the professors there who taught in the seminaries in Ukraine, they were sharing with me, like, when the war is over, and Lord willing, hopefully the war will be over. It's been dragging for a long time. They said, when we rebuild theological like seminaries to train the next generation of pastors, it has to be completely different than what we've had before, because nothing that we've taught prepared us for what's going on right now. And one person during Q&A said, asked me the question, like, Dave, Dr. Wang, I'm a third-generation Ukrainian Christian, and I grew up singing all the hymns, the traditional hymns in the Ukrainian language. And he said, all the hymns that I sang in Ukrainian were written in the minor key. And then he said, all of the worship songs we learned from the missionaries from America, they're written in the major key. And then he said, what's wrong with our worship? And I said, I don't know if there's anything wrong with your worship. If anything, there might be something wrong with our worship, because we probably need to sing songs in both the major key and the minor key. And there's probably a reason why your ancestors wrote all the hymns in the minor key, because this isn't the first time Russia invaded Ukraine, And I would even venture to suggest that if you look at the Psalms of the Bible, you know how there's 150 Psalms? Those are actually songs that King David and others sang. That was like the original worship music that's been, codified into the Word of God. Researchers in the Psalms, they suggest that upwards of 60 to 70% of all the Psalms in the Bible are actually Psalms of lament. Psalms of grief, right? And so I would suggest that if we still had the musical notes for the songs in the Psalms of the Bible, probably most of them are written in the minor key as well. They were songs that held the pain of God's people, right? And they were designed to do that. And they held also the heart of God as well. One last tidbit is that that same researcher that looked at the number of psalms in the Bible that qualify as psalms of lament, they also took the top 100 worship songs that are sung in churches here in America, and he asked the question, out of the top 100 songs we sing in America in churches here, what percentage, what proportion might qualify as psalms of lament? Would any of you guys guess? So we got from about 60 to 80% of the Psalms of the Bible or Psalms of Lament. How about the top 100 songs here in the U.S.? 20%? That's a great guess. It's less. It's less than 5%, 2 or 3%, right? So how did we get from 80% to 2 to 3%? I don't know. I think there's I have some opinions. Do y'all have some opinions? I'd love to hear them. Yes, Tina.
My opinion will be because we are a generation that is not cool, it's not okay to be sad. Let's just be happy. So let's just choose what is happy. Yes.
Yeah, do you think God's saying that? I don't think God's saying that. So,
I don't think so, because he wants us with a happy heart. So we just, maybe the enemy is just trying to just stay sad, feel miserable, don't sing happy songs, just sing a sad song, I don't know.
I do think there's some, part of my, I won't share my opinion yet, but there might be something cultural in America that is really uncomfortable with the sad feelings and would prefer us to only hang out in the happy feelings. And that may not actually be an accurate reflection of what's in the Word of God and what's in the Christian faith. What's your thought?
I was going to say something similar. I think that suffering, I think we have a harder time in the U.S. Being able to conceptualize Christianity as the fact that as Christians we do experience pain and suffering. And I think it goes against the narrative of what it means for cultural Christianity to be a follower of Jesus, that, you know, God is able and we, you know, and everything that you want, you can have, and everything's positive, and we tend to ignore the fact that in our experience as believers, we will experience both.
Yes.
And I think other countries are better at embracing that experience, that understanding. I think that in the U.S. we struggle with that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes, what is your thought?
I think it's just a direct conflict with the American dream.
It could be the American dream.
Picket fences and White Houses and, you know, cars and good jobs and nonsense.
Yeah, and if you just work hard and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like everything's going to be great at the end.
There's kind of a belief that, okay, you're not a good Christian if you're angry or
Yeah.
sad or you're depressed, because, okay, you're lacking faith, you're lacking joy.
Yeah.
This. So if you're, you know, experiencing hardships and feeling pain, and pain comes out in that way,
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we'll take passages like, in your anger, do not sin, and interpret in a way where it's like, oh, we shouldn't be angry at all. And that's not what the passage is saying. It's saying that we can be angry. In fact, God gets angry. Yeah, any other thoughts? Yes.
The research is correct. There are far more lament songs than that. So the lament songs is the most frequent genre of songs, and the second most is the hymn of praise. There are other genres as well, such as wisdom songs and word songs. I think what you're saying is correct, but I think it's probably true in the mainstream churches. I think that if we went to predominantly black churches,
Yes.
of lament songs,
Yes.
and also churches where they go through the liturgy, so they will have a different song.
Yes.
So in some churches, you're going to have an Old Testament passage, a psalm, a New Testament passage, and a gospel. So there they're going to go through more of the Psalter.
Oh, I
So
love
it does vary according to denomination, but in terms of your mainstream American denominations, it's far more happy.
Very good. Thank you for that additional nuance. It's probably the mainstream kind of maybe evangelical, I would say, evangelical / non-denominational. I've heard many of the spirituals of that's commonly sung in the African American church tradition, and those are absolutely psalms of lament, of groaning, of and liturgies. Perhaps like the Anglican liturgies, like Book of Common Prayer is also much more balanced. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? I love this conversation, please. Oh.
Because they know people don't want to listen to that type of music when the fact is going to make you sad or, to feel depressed. So they rather give out like good happy song. So they don't want to make it, or they don't want to like encourage people to write a song like this to put it out there.
I wouldn't be surprised if you might be onto something. There's something about songs that are happy that probably will sell easier or will draw bigger crowds. I don't know if we talked about, hey, why don't we come together and grieve together? I'm not sure if that's going to draw a bunch of people, even though we need it. Right?
Yeah, it may not be a pop or a rock, because if you listen to pop rock, there are a lot of breakup songs.
Yeah.
So it depends.
Oh, that's true.
It's a different genre.
Maybe it's a different genre. But for whatever reason, perhaps the evangelical worship genre, it doesn't seem to embrace the other emotions. Yeah?
Just taking your idea of this cultural, looking through the worship songs, if you look at American culture through our movies, so if you think about a French movie, the ending is always like, what? No, they died, the world was ended, and the end. And you're like, no, come on, here's the happy ending. And so in a French movie, you can almost always be assured that there's going to be reality at the end. And in America, there's going to be the happy ending.
Oh, yes, yes. I grew up in San Jose, California, so Northern California, and I grew up listening to a Christian radio station called K-Love. I don't know if they have it down here too, I think, right? Yeah, I still listen to K-Love. If you remember, what's the motto for K-Love? Positive, encouraging, K-Love. Right? And I think I get what they're trying to say, because there's a message of hope that's at the center of the gospel. But I think if we take that to it's possible to take that to an ending that may not actually be consistent with the Christian faith. If we were to take that and go, for me to be Christian must mean I have to be positive, encouraging all the time. And it's only positive, only encouraging. Anything that's different from 100% positive, 100% encouraging, it must not be Christian. I don't know if that's actually consistent with with our faith, right? Okay, we're going to revisit a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, but I really enjoyed and appreciate what we talked about. One question I'd like to invite you to consider is, what do you think of when you hear the word trauma? So if you're comfortable doing so, don't feel compelled, and you can just reflect on this on your own, but just for the next minute or so or two, if you're comfortable sharing with the person next to you, what's some of the first phrases or thoughts that come to mind? What do you think of when you hear the word trauma? So discuss with a friend next to you if you're comfortable. Is the air conditioning on?
And it's probably cycling between heating and AC doing it so cold outside.
Okay.
Is it too hot up on the
No, I'm okay. I'm just wondering if there's circulation. Okay, no worries. Yeah, we're good. Okay, let's come back together. Can we have maybe one or two if you're open to it? I'd love to hear what comes to mind in your mind when you hear the word trauma. What do you think of when you hear the word trauma? Yes.
So we had a kind of a definition, but also a question about it. So we're trying to talk about persistent pain.
Yeah. Yes.
But we were kind of curious the way you draw a line between what is genuinely traumatic and what is just like more like a negative life experience.
Yeah.
So let's say like you broke up with your girlfriend or boyfriend.
Yeah.
It was really bad, right?
Yeah.
Is that trauma? And that seems very different from, let's say, something like a war that broke out and you survived. So it's like where you draw the line between that.
Oh, such a good question. I'm afraid the field, we don't have a very good answer to that yet. We have a technical definition of what a trauma is, and at the same time, it's possible for hurtful experiences like what you mentioned, like a really bad breakup, to elicit trauma-like symptoms, and when that happens, if I get to accompany someone like that, I will actually employ close to all of the trauma techniques in that case, even though that situation may not technically fit the formal definition of what a trauma is. I also struggle with the definition of trauma because, on one hand, I'm really grateful that it feels like younger people are really comfortable and embrace that language, But I've also heard people use it. I mean, some people really need to start using that word more. And others, I feel like they use it a little bit too, they're a little too comfortable with that. And, I've heard even people say, my Starbucks barista got my thing wrong, that was traumatic. I'm like, well, I'm sure you're not happy about that, and we can be sad about it together, but I don't know if I would put it in the same category.
It's a positive thing because it's a huge change, disruption.
Yes.
I was mentioning, like, I work in a high school and the students are graduating,
Uh-huh.
and it's comfortable and safe, but now they're moving on. It could be a little bit traumatic
Yes,
for
yes.
someone because it's a positive thing, or moving, or a better job, or a marriage, or anything that could be deemed positive, but it's still a huge disruption to the normal flow of how life was comfortable, and that could be traumatic. in a
Yes.
way.
I mean, and it's a thing that needs to be reckoned with. It's not something we can just gloss over. Yes.
So this might be a bit of a naive question, but when I look at the definition that we suggested so far, lasting, impactful, maybe even at the level of a community,
Yeah.
so is a trauma, though, can it be positive, or it's always just a negative?
Good question. And we might actually even talk about this more formally, but there is a research literature now that talks about so PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's also a whole literature now on post-traumatic growth. So the answer to that question is yes, we can actually grow and learn things, and there can be positive outcomes associated with trauma as well. Usually, yes. And I would say that even when there's post-traumatic growth, the funny thing, I don't have a very good explanation for why this is the case, but the funny thing is that growth, it doesn't cancel out the consequences, right? Those two coexist at the same time. So for example, say, if we walked with people who have lost loved ones prematurely, and as the community surrounded this family and loved them, as the children matured earlier than they normally would, we can point to ways that they've grown in ways that they normally wouldn't have if they didn't lose the loved one, and we can point to look at how the people came together, and that's a blessing. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. That's growth, and that's good. And at the same time, if you were to ask that child, would you trade all that for mom and dad? They would say no. Do you still miss them? Yeah. Those things coexist. So even when the growth happens, there's still some sort of grief and loss that might persist as well.
Trauma has to do with individually.
Yes.
And I say one trauma as equal as the other.
Yeah.
Because let's say
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it depends on the culture, depends on the trauma, and depends on the individual.
Yes, absolutely. And some cultures, they are a lot more helpful in the grief process than other cultures. Some cultures are comfortable with grieving or even celebrating some kinds of traumas, but then there's other traumas that are taboo, they don't talk about. Every culture has its own unique perspective on trauma. So one question that we can consider is, within the culture that you grew up in, which traumas were celebrated and okay to talk about, and which traumas were the unspoken ones that we didn't talk about? Discuss with a few people next to you. Okay, let's come back together. Just as a few examples of this, some cultures celebrate some traumas. right? Where I did a lot of my training at the VA Medical Center, and I did a lot of trauma work with veterans of different foreign wars, and it's appropriate and common for people to get Purple Hearts, So when they come back, they can talk about, how they got wounded in combat, and they're heroes, rightly so, and we celebrate it. In the same VA hospital, we also had a unit for survivors of sexual assault that happened while they're in military, and we don't talk about that, even though that's a trauma too, and it also happens, and we even did some research with male survivors of sexual trauma. We don't even talk about that even more, there's some additional layer of like, whoa, and so in that particular culture, some traumas are interpreted some way and others are interpreted in other ways. Anyone open to sharing what y'all talked about? Yes. Yeah.
I remember that I was reading an article that was like, it said that there was a history of changing trauma over the years.
Yeah.
Of the word. And like there was one word that it was considered shell shock.
Mm-hmm.
Because we started looking into the effects of trauma for first it was the effects of trauma today.
Yeah.
For the effects of military people who come back after the wars and stuff.
That's right.
And then they change it to be trauma when they started having, when they started looking at women and they started to say, oh, it's not shell shock for them. It's like, they change the word. Is that what you are?
Oh, yeah. You're definitely onto something there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you are absolutely onto something there. And so trauma existed for a really long time before we even had the word. So when it comes to military trauma, for example, have you ever read Homer's Iliad? All the symptoms of PTSD from returning war veterans in Homer's Iliad, it's in there. So that's like thousands of years ago, and in more recent history, we had terms like shell-shocked, we had terms like soldier's heart, and the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and the term trauma actually didn't come into being until the Vietnam War era. So like 1970s, and at the time it was very controversial because people were wondering, is this more of a political diagnosis or is this a real diagnosis? And since then, fortunately, we don't think that anymore. The more we've done research, the more we've realized that, oh, this is actually a thing. This has been a thing for a long time. Though, and I think this is actually a good transition to, there is a formal clinical definition of what a traumatic event is, and this is it. And this was developed, back in the Vietnam War era in response to military trauma. And since then, and it's been, 50 years now, we're starting to realize more and more that the limitations of this definition of trauma, because this is normed after a military trauma which involves men who are young adults fighting in a completely different part of the world against people that they didn't know, had no relationship with, and there was a clear start date when the start time when the threat started, and a clear end time when the stop. So when people started shooting, and then when people stopped shooting, you can point to a definitive time when the trauma started and when the trauma ended. And since then, we started to realize, well, what about trauma involving children? What about trauma involving family members, where you actually knew the people who were hurting you? What about traumas that wasn't like one specific event, but I've heard people say, I don't know how to tell my story of trauma because it was my whole childhood. It never changed, And then there's the trauma of neglect. Those are all traumas too, but they don't quite fit this formal definition, which I'll read right now. It's when a person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. Right? So, thanks. Great point. Yeah. So, if we were to diagnose someone with PTSD, this definition is actually probably the place that we would start. There's a lot of imperfections to this. So I don't know if this is my preferred approach, but I am bound to use it, because of the way that things are formally defined in the DSM. But what I would like to do is share a definition that's a bit more vague, but a definition that I personally prefer. You don't necessarily need to agree with me on this, but the definition of a trauma that I would prefer is actually from a psychoanalyst by the name of Robert Stollerow, and he says this: trauma is what happens when severe emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held. Right? I'll read that one more time. Trauma is what happens when severe emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held. And what's a relational home? It's a context. It's a relational context. It's a friendship. It's a small community in which your painful emotional experiences, the ones that are more culturally acceptable, as well as the ones that the culture don't talk about as much, where you can share it, where other people will understand, where you feel understood, and where your pain, your emotional pain, can be held by others. So drawing that back to what we shared earlier, I feel like the worship songs of my third-generation Ukrainian friend, those hymns were probably a really good relational home for the pain of his people. And perhaps many of our songs that are a lot more positive, there's nothing wrong with them. But if that's all we sing, that might not be a very good relational home for our pain, right? And maybe what we want to do is bring ourselves back into more of the alignment in Scripture, where we sing some songs of joy, and we also sing some songs of lament and grief. We sing both of them. We make sure we make space for both of them, knowing that they're not inconsistent with one another. And, something I wish I had time to share yesterday is that, Christ is a perfect relational home for our pain as well. He's experienced trauma as well. He knows what it's like, and he can hold the trauma. He can hold the emotional pain that we have. So, I gave you guys a teaser yesterday. How do you heal? How does one recover? What does the journey of recovery look like from trauma? And from the passage that we read together yesterday, first starting point is, well, healing doesn't mean that our scars disappear altogether, right? And that's when we landed that point that Jesus, even in his resurrected body that conquered sin and death, he still had scars on his hands and on his sides. So if that's the case, then our healing must also mean that we might have some scars too, and that's okay. The second point that we ended with yesterday is that healing also doesn't mean that we forget, right? And, in the book of Revelation, when it talks about when Jesus returns and ushers in the new heavens and the new earth, one of the names that we give to Jesus, even in the new heavens and the new earth, is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, right? So even then, we don't forget what Jesus went through, and during communion time, every time we take communion, we remember Christ's trauma. So if healing, or making progress in our healing, if it's not about not having scars, and if it's not about forgetting what happened, what is it ultimately about? There's a friend and colleague. His name is Dan Allender. I don't know if some of you guys have heard of him. He's up in Seattle, and he's a psychologist and a Christian, and he actually specializes in supporting people in their recovery from childhood sexual trauma. He's a survivor himself, and he's one of the first people in the Christian world to really dive into like what that actually looks like with that specific kind of wounding. And for the last 5 years or so, I got to work with Dan and his team at the Allender Center, because Dan's in his 60s and he's about to retire, and they're wondering what the Allender Center's work is going to look like in the future. So part of our work together is we're trying to codify, and he's written like a gazillion books on the topic. So if you're interested in that topic, I would really strongly recommend you consider reading some of his work. His name is Dan Allender. And what we did is we spent a week in Seattle in a team retreat, and during that team retreat, we asked the question: if we can summarize and synthesize 30 years of Dan's life work on how do you recover from sexual trauma in your childhood, and codify it into like one or two sentences, what would it be? And this is what we came up with. Dan, and I would agree with this wholeheartedly, he says, healing is actually not about finding resolution. All right? Why? I would suggest that there are some traumas in which it's possible to come to a resolution, but there's also other traumas where it's not possible to come to a resolution, right? For example, a lot of times when people see psychologists like Dennis and myself and Kristen and others, they might be sharing for the first time something that happened to them 40 years ago. And by the time they shared what happened, the person who hurt them has already passed away. They can't talk to them anymore. There's no possibility to reconcile. And other times, when the person's still alive, and you try to reconcile with them, they're not repentant. They don't acknowledge what's going on. You can't get resolution in that way. Have you ever experienced some hurt involving your family members, and those family members just are not going to change? And resolution's not possible no matter how hard you try, right? And resolution requires two people to go into the process. If you're the only one who's willing to go all the way, you actually can't reach resolution still, because the other person has to freely be willing to freely engage in that process as well. But even in those situations, healing is still possible, even without resolution. So how do you heal from trauma? It's actually not about resolution. According to Dan, and I would wholeheartedly agree again, what is healing about? It's about telling a truer story of your life, one that holds both the beauty as well as the brokenness. So notice, he doesn't say, it's not about telling a more positive story of your life. It's about telling a truer story of your life, right? I don't know if you've ever worked with people who are narcissistic. Maybe not. But I would say that narcissists generally don't have a problem telling a positive story of their life. It's just not true, right? And there's something about telling a truer story that invites us to hold both the beauty as well as the brokenness. And for different individuals, the invitation towards a truer telling of your story might be different. Here's an example. So I grew up in a family that ruminates all the time, So if something bad happened, my family culture would just think about it over and over and over again, find someone to blame, and just get mad, and then it just gets even more mad, and it's not, and then we just focus on all the negative stuff, and then we get more work. It's like that's the family culture that I grew up in, right? So the invitation to tell a truer story, for me, actually was about me also acknowledging that maybe there was beauty here too. So I didn't just ruminate in the negative. I also needed to pull myself out of that and recognize that there might actually be new life, and there might have been some good there as well, so that this could be a truer story. My wife's family, on the other hand, is completely different. She grew up in the Bible Belt, and her family is positive all the time, and they don't know what to do with the negative emotions, right? They just kind of avoid it altogether, And that's also not a truer story. So the invitation into telling a truer story is actually the opposite for her. It was actually an invitation for her to recognize that maybe there's some brokenness here that we just haven't talked about. But it's, and it's taken us about 20, 30 years to kind of get there, but God's very patient with us, So the question I want to invite you to consider is, what is the invitation for each of you when we invite you to tell a truer story of your life? Is it to get into the brokenness more, or is it to get into more of the beauty, right? Let me pause here. Any questions or any comments or reflections? And I would suggest that many of, or most of the trauma therapies are very much inconsistent with this. They might add a few more ingredients, of course.
Yeah, so I have a question about this definition and the one you did before about the relational space.
Yeah.
Does the story have to be one that you can just privately tell yourself, like as in a journal? Or does it have to be articulated in front of someone to be a relational? So,
Yes, it can be a story you tell yourself.
like just journaling about it can be therapeutic.
Absolutely. As long as what you're journaling helps you move towards telling it in a truer way. Yeah.
And then I guess follow up, would it be even more effective if it were then told in front of somebody else? So is there kind of like, you do it both and say, having someone listen to it well is healing?
Absolutely. It's a both and. And oftentimes when you tell the story to someone else, especially if it's a really difficult story to tell, many of us will be understandably very reluctant to share it because we don't know how other people are going to react. They might judge us. They might think of us differently. They might go, "Whoa, I can't believe that happened," and kind of step further away. And that's why when a lot of people who we get to walk alongside trauma survivors, our body language is really important. So I almost make it a point when someone shares something really heavy and that they're not sure how people are going to respond, I'm going to actually lean in, and at the end, we might say something like, "Hey, that was really difficult to share. Thanks for sharing that with me. Now I feel like I know you a lot better, and I appreciate that gift that you're giving me where I get to actually know you, what's really in your heart, And when someone has that experience of someone else holding your story, oftentimes what happens is we give ourselves permission to tell that story to ourselves with more accuracy and with more truth. Yeah. And I think that applies to God too, right? We can absolutely, in our prayer life, tell our story to God as well. I wouldn't do that with non-Christian clients because that's kind of, you have to think about the ethics there. But for people who are Christians, I don't end where trauma treatment ends. I oftentimes will continue and go, what does it look like to include this conversation with God as well? Yeah. And then when that happens, then we kind of shift from the traditional realm of psychotherapy into more of the realm of spiritual direction. Any other comments or questions or reflections? Yes?
I guess my question would be around when somebody does experience trauma, whether it be one big trauma experience or a longer trauma environment or experience. When that person, for example, 20 years later comes to you in therapy and they're working on things and they expose what they believe to be their trauma experience or event, a lot of times, even those in the military, et cetera, they talk about this event, but there's many trauma since then.
That's right.
Whatever addiction they may have.
That's right.
Added to that trauma. So how do you
Great question. And that's actually usually the case. So research would suggest that not only is it the case that most people in the world have experienced a trauma, but when people experience a trauma, it's usually not just one trauma. On average, it's about 4 to 5 traumas per person, you know. And when you finally get to a point where you uncover the first one, usually it unfolds the next 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you know, we want to get ready for that, you know, because so it's usually a safe bet to go, okay, we're talking about this trauma. This is not the only one. So when we finish this arc, go in assuming and allow yourself to be pleasantly surprised if this isn't the case. There's probably going to be another one that just gets opened up that perhaps it wasn't consciously in my mind until I brought up the first one. Yeah. So for example, with child abuse, you know, oftentimes, you know, what gets people in the door is, you know, say, for example, like, you know, a father abused them, you know, as a child. And we give them permission to feel the feelings that need to be felt with that kind of thing. And then at some point, and this, I'm thinking of a few people I got to walk with, you know, when someone uncovers trauma, what ends up happening is we end up doing grief therapy, right? Because someone explained it to me, and I totally agree, that they said that all trauma therapy is in fact grief therapy, because all trauma involves some form of loss, whether it's symbolic or, you know, concrete, you know. And so we were doing a lot of grief work, and part of grief is anger, you know. So, you know, so we held that anger at Dad for literally a year and a half. And after a year and a half, and there's lots of different directions of where that anger wanted to go, and after a year and a half, it's almost as if the soul, you know, reached a point of saturation where I was like, okay, I think I'm done being angry now. You know, it's all been held. And like clockwork, all of a sudden, there was this realization, where the hell was Mom? I never considered that. But now that I've had now that this anger at Dad has been held and passed, I've now have the freedom to reconsider, Mom actually knew exactly what the heck was going on. Why the heck did she not do anything? And lo and behold, trauma number 2. And we had to go, and a lot of times it unfolds like that, one after another.
I was thinking about that. What about like with mandated reporters, if they reported and the child is removed from the home? Is that another trauma that a lot of people experience?
Yeah. And a lot of times social workers are in impossible situations where if the child stays, there's harm. If you take them out, it's not an easy process either. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments or questions or reflections? Yes.
I kind of like how you said it's a truer story.
Yeah.
That truer means like, it's not the fact that the story that you have that is mostly about beauty and mostly about wholeness was not true.
Right.
It's just that you were ignoring the other part.
Yes. Yes. Yes, a truer story. Not to say that the original story was false. It just may have been incomplete. Yes.
I'm curious if there's always, your truer statement might get at this, is there always a truth to be arrived at? And what about the possibility of going more into falsehood?
Yeah, good question. There are many situations, especially when it comes to childhood trauma involving children that were pre-verbal, you know, the younger you get, and where there are limitations on, I don't know exactly what happened. It was so long ago. I know something happened, but sometimes, unfortunately, and it feels cruel when it happens, that you know, we get to a point where there might not be any living survivor that could actually tell us what happened, you know, and we might be left at a place where, you know, we've gone this far, but beyond this, we're not too sure, you know. So at that point, I think the process of recovery is less about finding more details so I can tell a truer story in that sense, and it'll be more about grieving what I do know, and then maybe even that grief process moving to a place of also grieving what I don't know and I can't know on this side. How do I build a life in light of all that I do know and can know and all that I don't know at the same time? Yeah. Great question.
So maybe along those lines, what if you're searching for the true story and you continue to unpack and it just keeps coming? How do you keep from just finding despair?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just building a story of being peace.
Yeah, good question. Like my personal take on this, and please add, those of you who are trained, please chime in here, is that you don't have to think about your story 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In fact, I would suggest that probably isn't a good idea. So I think when people run into problems is when they never think about it or never talk about it. That's when the story just kind of stays set, right? If you could have just one context where you can, seriously go into it, either with yourself, with God, with someone else, if that just happens once a month or maybe once every other week, I think that's, and if that's, that's actually for many of us all that our souls can handle, and I think that's enough, And oftentimes I will tell people, encourage people, all the other times that you want to think about it, you're welcome to just distract yourself. Listen to some music, just go, hey, it's there, it's not a threat, but my mind wants to jump on this train where I just go do a deep dive, and I'm gonna gently guide my mind a different direction, and I think that's okay too, and there is something about when you do share the story and it's held by someone, it's almost like every time you tell it, the story gets slightly different. I start adding details that never were there before. I start adding context, like, and when this happened, I was thinking of this, and I felt this in my body, and so it becomes more full. So it's not just this happened at 10 a.m., this happened at 10:05. The story actually begins to fill itself out. And research finds that the more coherent your story is, the lower the symptoms that you're going to experience. So there's something about reconstructing that story bit by bit into a more coherent story with context that is very much at the heart of the recovery journey. And at the end, I don't think we're ever asking anyone to be happy about what happened. Right? So it's not like I'm telling the story so that, after saying it 1,000 times, I'm going to be happy that it happened. Not suggesting that at all. But after 1,000 times, I might tell a much more full story. After 1,000 times, I might not be afraid of my story anymore. After 1,000 times, I might not see the memory of my story as the threat that it used to be in my mind. After sharing it 1,000 times, maybe in the early stages, I would get, really amped up to like a 8 out of 10 distress level. But now when I share that same story, instead of going to an 8 out of 10, now it goes to a 3 out of 10. It doesn't go to a 0 out of 10, it just goes to a 3, but I also know how to handle it now, and it's not going to ruin the rest of the week. It's not going to ruin the rest of the day. I can recover quickly. Those are all signs of recovery. Yeah. Do you have a question here, or?
I did have a question.
Oh, yeah.
I do have a question. Going back to if it's a family member or someone that's very close to you,
Yeah.
is leaving, and but you at the point
Yeah.
But it seems like it's still part of your story, and sometimes you tell your friends, close friends, what happened,
Yeah.
and then you feel like, oh, this person is actually is someone that I'm close with, and as a Christian, is it okay to touch base with the person, and this person has changed, and
Hmm.
actually she's my mom, just one second.
Yeah.
It's not really like something like we have a great relationship now,
Oh, good.
but I wonder if it's good for her, if it's good for her to talk about it. Maybe on her part, it's good for her
Yeah.
to know that I'm in peace and I'm okay.
Yeah.
So that's my question. Is
Oh.
it okay to talk about it? But we are doing okay. But
Okay.
I was wondering, is she ever going back and forth?
Yeah.
It's a good thing to talk about it.
Yeah. Good question. Every situation is different, so it's difficult to speak of general principles that would apply, to everyone's circumstances. But, I think most or all of us know what it's like to be in a situation like the one that you're sharing. So thank you for sharing that. Usually what I will start with is I would say, as a Christian, you're not required to. Because forgiveness and healing doesn't actually mean that we're reconciled. Right? Because again, reconciliation requires two people to take part, and we don't have control over how the other person will respond. So we cannot carry the burden of reconciliation on just ourselves. I think in some cases, it could be considered to have a conversation, if you have a good relationship, if you feel it's safe, and you think taking that risk is, you're open to that, I think that's something that certainly is a possibility, But I've met so many Christians who feel like I have no choice. I have to talk to the person who harmed me and try to reconcile. And the thing I get really worried about is that a lot of times it's actually not safe to talk to them, because when you talk to them in that very open-hearted way, like, I've been hurt and I've been in this process of forgiving, you actually make yourself vulnerable because you're opening your heart to that person. And if that person is not trustworthy with that, they can probably stab you, hurt you again. And now you have another thing that you need to forgive them, right? So especially if it's not safe, I would even recommend not doing that, but it's possible. Yeah, it's certainly possible. And not in your case, but in other cases, as a pastor, I find that many Christians, myself included, we jump to forgiveness a little too quickly, right? We jump into forgiveness a little bit too quickly. And I would like to suggest that you can't actually forgive someone until you tell the truth, until you're able to tell a truer story of what happened, right? The way forgiveness was taught to me growing up in church, it was really more about making myself small and minimizing the hurt that I experienced, right? So it's like, okay, someone just harmed me and that was hurtful. Oh, that's okay, I forgive you. It doesn't matter that you betrayed me, and this hurt is, I feel all these emotions, but that's okay, it's not a big deal, and I forgive you, And I would suggest that's actually not forgiveness. That's avoidance. That's denial. And denial is the first stage of grief, That's you not being willing to grieve what happened. You cannot forgive what you have not grieved yet, right? Because when you grieve, you actually own the hurt that happened. And without owning the hurt that happened, I cannot let it go and forgive it. So if we want to just go straight to letting it go without actually owning and acknowledging what happened, I don't think that's possible.
Well, I think of the 12 steps, and you think of the 12 steps.
Yeah.
You're not getting into amends or forgiveness until the 8th or 9th step. You have to work all those other steps before you even get to that.
Yes, we can't skip all the way to 8.
It also seems like if you make the move to telling the true story, you're forced to have to see things over from their perspectives,
Yeah.
which may make that forgiveness easier in the sense where you're not denying the hurt, but you're kind of like, okay, I understand, maybe it's a little more complicated.
Yeah, that's right.
So then it, in some ways, kind of exercising empathy.
That's right.
That's really interesting.
And again, it's paradoxical. So it's like, okay, well, looking at it from their perspective, why do they act in this way? If I know a little bit more about their history, maybe they have trauma too. And they're acting out of their pain, they didn't know better. And then I go back to this question of, well, that's true, I can have empathy, I can have a different perspective, but again, that doesn't justify what happened still, right? So I still hold those things in tension. I can see their humanity without negating my own humanity. So forgiveness requires us to hold another person's humanity and hold our humanity at the same time. So many times when forgiveness is preached, it's about someone else's humanity, but my humanity doesn't matter. You can step over me all if you want, because I can just, that's okay. And that's actually not forgiveness. That's being a doormat. Wow, I wasn't expecting to go here. We have a few more minutes. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? I think we're heading a good direction. Yes.
I wanted to revisit this possibility of telling lies to ourselves. So, like in courtrooms, it seems like it's often this concern that people can bring up like false memories and
Yes.
like elaborate false memories.
Yes.
So, how do we or how do you deal with that?
Yeah. That's very tricky, and say, for example, when, and there's, I'm not trying to get into the politics of this, but when one of the Supreme Court justices, Brett Kavanaugh, was, in the process of being confirmed, there were allegations of, prior sexual, assault, and the ways the lawyers went after this woman, was, through that lens of like, sometimes the memories that emerge and, when we recall the trauma, they may not be entirely accurate, and because there's inconsistencies, that must mean that nothing, must mean that you're wrong, and we can confirm this judge, and my view on that was that, part of the reason why memories are really tricky is because one of the most common psychological responses to trauma is what we call dissociation. So when we dissociate, and it's almost like our mind goes blank. Our physical body is here, but our mind is somewhere else. We're spaced out. When you work with trauma survivors, a lot of times you want to look at their eye. If their eye is just staring out into the void, it probably means that they're dissociating. There's a reason why we dissociate. Dissociation is very, very common when it comes to sexual trauma involving children. And that goes back to the fight or flight response, right? So imagine if you're a child and there's someone, sorry I'm going into so much detail, and let's say the perpetrator is a family member, right? What are your options with your flight or fight? One is to fight. You're 5 years old. You can't fight off. You're overpowered. Flight, I can't run away. This is home. Where am I going to run away from, right? So the third option is freeze, and that's, dissociative response, which is I can't physically relocate my body because I don't have the power to, but I can check out in my mind. And in doing so, I can protect myself, right? That's one of the reasons why we can't remember. So in a situation like that, I would say, even though I don't remember all the details of the memory, I can tell you 100% something happened. Yeah. And, unfortunately, when I'm in the therapy room, I'm not a court of law, so what I most care about is that something happened, and I can run with it in that way. But I think we can still be grounded in the truth of, even though I don't know all the details of what happened, and a lot of it's muddy, just by the reactions and by your dissociative response, I know for sure something happened. And unfortunately, that's an example of people getting re-traumatized. Yeah. Maybe one last comment or question. Sorry, I know this is heavy stuff. But I think this is a good time to pause. Thank you so much for just jumping in. I have a ton of slides, and oftentimes it's the case that we only get through about 25% of them, but happy to share all of them with you at the end still, and I think what I would prefer is to kind of get into a rhythm of what's in the room, and to be responsive to what's in the room. So looking forward to our ending conversation as well. We'll have plenty to talk about there as well.
Thank you, Dave, for what you've shared so far. And I can't help but observe that this group is opening some doors. I mean, you're being very brave and very penetrating in some of the questions and issues that you're raising. There's a lot here, and so I appreciate that dialogue that we're going into. If this is useful, sometimes with things that are traumatic or disturbing to us, I think of two basic modalities. That sometimes we need to take hold of something and make it truer, or deal more directly with it, stop our avoidance. Other times we need to release something, even if we're not done with it yet. And that can help us get through the obsessive remembering, or something that's really hard to get free of. We want to include both here. We have our breakouts now, and so we'll be doing, we have breakout A and breakout B. We have one breakout right here in the room with Nella Valencia and this is the relational side of trauma recovery. Traveling together through the experience of trauma is a strong relational side, as Dave has already pointed out. And then there is the embodied side. Melissa Kulisekri will be leading a breakout in the fireside room. It's across the lobby there. And you'll be able to participate in both breakouts, just not simultaneously. So whichever one you pick first, then you go to the other one second. And this is, and Melissa's section is on how you can heal the wounded mind through the body. That embodied avenue that can help us heal and release trauma. So take a few moments in transition. And any questions as we're good? All right. And so we will have two of those breakouts back to back. Each will be about 40 minutes. And then we'll continue with Dave here at 4. Okay? All right. So let's go ahead.
I'll start in 5 minutes, so grab a drink, go to the bathroom, hug someone, take a little break. We'll start in 5 minutes if you want to stay in this first break.
Nice to see you. How are you feeling? see you. I'm fine. That's why I'm here. I'm fine.
I was thinking about that was all spirituality.
Good stuff, dude. Yeah, this guy's good. I'm chatting with your wife. Okay, well, I'm sure you guys will forgive there too. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
How does that drag out audio?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah, because the first breakout's right here. Or there's one breakout here and there's one breakout in that corner right over there. So, yeah, if you're going to go over there, you can leave it. You could probably just leave it. Yeah. But you might want to write notes over there, I don't know. Oh, just saying.
That wouldn't gain me much for the parsonage fund, would it? But hey, you know what? Every buck is a buck. It's funny. I didn't go to the group in the afternoon. I came in the morning, but I went home. I had such a massive headache. I'm good today.
Good, good.
I'm good today. I wanted to be here